You're not going to the United States. That's why the United States is very comfortable. The United States is protected by two great oceans, and that's the theory of the great American island. That's why we Latin Americans are so important for them, because that great American island is safe, while in the South there are no governments like Chavez, Correa, and others, and everything flows. They believe that if the rest of the planet disappears, if Europe and Eurasia sink, Africa disappears, they have a full refrigerator with South America, oil, water, food, which is water is the war of the future. So it's very comfortable for this military plan, because they don't pay the debt. The wars are won with infantry. I don't know if I'm saying infantry was the king of the battles, because it occupies the land. With the drones you can destroy many cities, but who enters to handle that, to govern? In the worst scenario, we have 4 minutes. We have a homage that was made to Commander Hugo Chavez. I think it's very important. And honoris causa doctorate. I will read it because it was very nice. March 10th, 2017. University of Lanús, Argentina, hereby grants this honoris causa doctorate to Hugo Chavez Frias, Argentina, March 9, 2017. The Superior Council of the University of Lanús, Buenos Aires, hereby grants the honoris causa doctorate to Mr. Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias, considering that the leader of the Bolivarian Revolution compensated the historic debt of neoliberalism and vindicated and dignified excluded social classes. This acknowledgement, academic acknowledgement, was received by his older brother, Alan Chavez Frias, current Minister of the Popular Power of Culture. The Dean of this university emphasized first that this university hereby grants this post-mortem doctorate following the values of Latin American integration, the defense of the continent's human rights and human dignity as essential values present in this university. Hugo Chavez moved and interfered in the new global geopolitical order, a fairer and more human system that still must be supported for this construction. It is not casual that Venezuela is excluded from our continent, from our common markets, from our parliament. This makes us angry because Chavez struggled for Latin American integration. And the last thing, from Maracaibo, I brought this beautiful book called La Muerte de Hugo Chavez, of a young investigator, Astolfo Sangroni Godoy, who is in Maracaibo. It's a definite work to show how he was murdered. I want to take advantage of this. I know that many people watches your program in Venezuela and outside. I'd like to recommend this book and tell the people who, my friends in Argentina, that this week, Tuesday and Wednesday, I will be in very important towns because of the struggle against mining, Esquel and Bolsón. We'll see each other there. I received an email from a physician professor And he said that he watched my program. I am such and such professor of such and such of the university such and such in the United States, and based on my specialty, what Chavez has could be generated by high-density microparticles. I remember that when I was invited to a neighbor country at lunch, we were a country that accepted the 7 American bases we refused. And a guy was bringing the food, and Chavez asked, who is this aide who brings me the food? I haven't named any aide. Well, this is an unforgettable program with our friend, whom I hope to have every time you come here. Well, it's a luxury to be in your program because I can talk with a great specialist, and I know you have a first-level audience regarding commitment, information with these struggles in Latin America. Thank you very much, Walter. We'll be back tomorrow when our dear contaminated only spacecraft has turned around, and we're here to share the history of the next 24 hours. This has been a banquet.
teleSUR features the developments of science and technology that innovate and make the world go around.
Eso es Atomum, transmitimos desde América Latina. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas.
Technology available to everybody. Atomum. Mondays, only on teleSUR. In a world infested by inequalities, abuse of power, and injustice, the American journalist Abby Martin covers the struggle for fundamental rights worldwide, deepening into the search of files which uncover the empire's strategies through our screen and web platform in English. The Empire Files with Abby Martin. Tuesday, only on teleSUR. Different causes motivate people to look for new horizons. We'll have the right to move freely beyond the imposed walls. Imaginary lines are shown between the hostility towards some
Y la oportunidad de otros para forjar nuevos caminos.
Buscamos la respuesta a las inquietudes del siglo XXI.
between borders. Thursdays, only on teleSUR.
As Americans gear up to celebrate Thanksgiving, a day symbolizing a friendly autumn feast between Native Americans and colonial pilgrims, we're reminded of the true plight and untold story of destruction of a culture that this country is really founded upon. To gain insight on the history and current struggle of Native peoples, I'm here in San Francisco with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, leading Indigenous scholar, activist, and author. Her latest book is titled An Indigenous People's History of the United States. We grew up learning that Columbus discovered America, and that whatever society existed before that was primitive and barbaric. Talk about what Native society really looked like at that time.
It was just the opposite. The whole hemisphere was actually ancient in terms of cultural development and population migrations there, unlike the theory of the Bering Strait and of the wandering Neolithic. That's mainly from North America, that settler colonialism wanting to make the native disappear. Columbus came first to the Caribbean, which was a swarm of trade routes and interchanges among all those people of the islands. And very few people know that of the 7 designated areas of the beginnings of ancient agricultural civilizations, we know when we grew up, well, Tigris-Euphrates River, of course. That's the one we know best because supposedly that's where Europeans got culture from, a very contested area still. But we also know about China, had two areas of agricultural civilization development. And in North Africa, but the other 3 were in the Americas. One was in the Andes, agricultural civilization, one central Mexico, Mesoamerica, and the other the entire eastern half of what is now the United States. So actually they were conquering, when they came to North America, they were conquering an area larger than and richer in agriculture than Europe at the time. So they basically annexed all these things. These civilizations, advanced civilizations, existed when the Europeans came, and they appropriated them. In North America especially, they have a rewriting of history so that by the time later generations get there, say after the 13 colonies are formed or the United States is independent, those 13 colonies are independent, they see none of that because it's all been appropriated and changed for commercial agriculture. These were civilizations that were expropriated, and the people either made into slaves, because they enslaved Indians first, were the first slaves to be bought and sold on the market and to work in the mines that the Spanish started. Slaves were taken from North America even before the English came to take into the mines in Mexico and Peru. With colonialism displacing people, so they had no longer had their food supply, their housing, they're refugees. We see refugees in the world now. They're completely dependent on institutions to take care of them, but the only institution was the colonial, either the Spanish or the Portuguese or the English or the French and Dutch colonialists, and their desire was to weaken them, control them. There were, not all of these were deaths, but that the disappearance of up to 90% of Native people as parts of a group happened within 30 years of conquest, at every stage of conquest. These people have very little defense. The Spanish used armored horses. They grew very, very large horses for the conquest. They were fully armored from head to toe, which made them like little tanks. The soldier was also armored from head to toe, and they had dogs that they bred for the purpose of killing people. This was a fierce and extremely frightening, aggressive army, not one that wanted to have diplomatic relations or trade relations, but just wanted total dominance. You can see the means of disappearance of whole groups, like the Natchez people of the Mississippi Valley, who were the people of Cahokia, the people who built this advanced civilization, farmers. The Spanish raided them, and Eastern Honduras, and Western Honduras and Nicaragua. Those were the main slave-taking areas. So their DNA is there somewhere, but they're no longer a part of a people. You see what I mean? So it's killing the cultural cohesion and existence of a people, not just reducing their numbers. And that was a real intention. Even when they wanted people for slaves, they wanted to destroy the cultural ties, the languages, the sovereignty and existence, the governmental structures, the autonomous, independent governmental structures. All the colonialisms destroyed that.
I wanted to address something that you mentioned in your book, which is the feat of the fact that how many indigenous people have survived that period. I mean, just the sheer amount. What prevented Native people from being completely exterminated? Was it just the inclusion in the slave system at that time?
It's not a miracle because, of course, it was because of their resistance and resilience and determination to survive. And I think the complexity of their cultures, that they were able to, unless they were all killed off or deported like the Natchez to another part of the world, they maintained their ties as long as they were in their homelands. Survival is really what should be talked about rather than disappearance, because, well, Native people are still here. The settlers and the armed settlers had to fight for every inch of land they took, from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the Gulf to the Canadian border. And that cost a lot. It cost, they had 5 regiments of 6 that existed out the Army of the West after the Civil War, fighting Plains people who were not that populous, not that many, but had horses, had taken horses from the Spanish and could defend themselves. So they couldn't defeat them. They had to make peace treaties with them. And they got very large settlements that were then whittled down politically as they made the Native communities completely dependent. In the case of the Plains people, they killed all the buffalo. It was sort of a buffalo genocide of 60 million buffalo in the Plains. And they, when they put the trains through, as a part of your train ticket, you got a rifle to shoot out the window. Buffalo's a big animal and not very hard to kill with a rifle. So basically, counterinsurgency, Western counterinsurgency that came out of colonialism, it's what they call a food fight. They call it themselves the food fight, where you destroy the food supply of the people, the civilians. And then they have to sue, they starve or they give in.
One of the things that particularly horrified me from your book, Roxanne, was that headhunting, scalp hunting was not an underground business. It was actually a lucrative economy. Talk more about this.
They actually had a ordinance that allowed for the for bounties to be paid for heads that were brought in. They brought this directly, this practice, the British practice, in the colonization of Ireland, where they had started taking heads and then scalps or other body parts. It turned out, the head was just, there were so many of them. Even in Ireland, they turned to scalps. They would use the heads also to terrorize people, put them along the paths and everything to terrorize people and to surrender, because they'd see their families' heads there, and they would hide the corpses so they couldn't even get their family member back. So it was partly terror, but it was also, it became a commercial market. And so no one checked very closely if it was supposed to be only when there were Indian uprisings or a war. But it became the practice after a few years, just they could say, these were warring Indians, but they could basically go in a village and just grab a bunch of children even, or elderly people, take their scalps, kill them, and sell them. It was, quite a lucrative trade for people to, especially poorer people to make an income, and some people actually lived off of that income alone. They were scalp hunters. So that spread, of course, with everywhere, throughout the colonies, and then, in the wars against the native people in east of the Mississippi, then west of the Mississippi, the scalp taking. So this is a commodity, the bodies themselves, but this left corpses. The descriptions I've read of some people who were actually repelled by it wrote in their diaries and various things, letters back to England, these bloody bodies all over, because taking the scalp, of course, it causes blood to flow all over the body. They also often flayed the skin and used the skin of these people for various things. Jackson's army did that a lot. They made their rein. They were very proud of the horse reins. Were all made from Indian skins. So that kind of fetishism continued into the 20th century in Vietnam, where soldiers were sending back all kinds of body parts to their relatives and all. So it's it's just kind of built into the military culture doing that, because it was malicious, but then those are the same people then who become parts of standing armies and so forth. So it was pretty much a free enterprise, all right, of doing that. But there was also the name they gave to what they would use, referring to this bloody corpse, is the term redskin. And that's why it's so repugnant to, the ball team that calls itself that. It's not just any old misuse and appropriation of native names and symbols. It's ghoulish, so it's but most people don't know the origin of the, of the word redskin. It was a description of these bloody corpses whose heads have been cut off or their scalp taken.
Wow. And it's, speaking of military culture, now you see Native nomenclature embedded within the military establishment, from equipment to weapons to unit. What is the significance of this?
Well, I call it a fetish, that it built into the Army, which in the United States has only rarely been used for any purpose except conquest. Even the Civil War, not to take the side of the Confederacy, but they pretty much used the same methods, of scorched earth and food fight and so forth against the Southern. I mean, they were fighting on Southern territory. But only in World War I, World War II did you have late-coming Americans fight, let's say, a standard, what you think of as war, and that's why those wars are tooted so much and others kind of put aside. There has to be some kind of dehumanization involved. Most recently, and it's not so recent anymore to people because, you know, those of us who were adults or students anyway in the 60s saw these things happening on television, and those of us who knew this history said, this rings a bell, you know, and also their use of the term Indian country for enemy territory. Almost every generation has to have a regeneration through violence in order to justify its actions, you know, by doing it again. And it does seem that way. And then, not to speak of the civilians who take it in their own hands, no more militias, so they just go out and shoot up a bunch of people. So there are these hanging threads of colonialism that are very troublesome, you know, in the culture that people think, you know, banning guns or doing this or that without really considering what's the historical kind of psychological, what's at work there.
Before, when you were speaking about genocide and you know, how the term encompasses the institutionalized attempt to destroy a culture, a heritage, and entire peoples, I wanted you to just quickly address the re-education camps, because I don't think a lot of people really know that that happened, and how many people were integrated in this dehumanizing process.
His name was Pratt, General Pratt. He said, let's teach them English and cut. So he has their hair cut off, puts them in army uniform, drills them all the time, and then gets some of the teachers from the colony there, the settlement, civilian settlement there, some of the teachers to come in and teach them English, and some of the, you know, others to encourage their artwork. And then he starts, they get so adjusted, you know, they're completely separated from their families and all. And they're told that they can be better off, you know, than being these savages that they were. And so it's just kind of a brainwashing. He thinks this experiment works pretty well, and he builds it up into a report to the Department of War, which is what it was called at the time, to have this be more routine practice, to take the children away. He says it's hard with the adults. Some of them backslide, you know, and try to escape, and there's a rebel among them, but take them as children and put them far away from their families, cut their hair, and make them into, you know, and his motto was to kill the Indian and save the man. So that was, you know, to kill the Indian, that person, so they could just be an individual. Christianizing came along with it. So they set up these federal boarding schools, and then it became mandatory. All Native families had to bring their children in to be taken to, and so this whole network of boarding schools were set up. And if you didn't turn the children in, the an army unit would come out and either take one of the people, usually the father of the family, away, imprison him until, you know, they said where they're hiding the kids. And somewhere there were some interesting stories of some families that were able to hide out some of the young people and hide them in caves and take food to them, you know, and they didn't learn English, so they became the transmitters of the culture because they realized what was happening. Mm-hmm. They took them away at 5 years old, and they couldn't return until 16. So they missed all of the elements of, you know, their cultural learning. So this was generations, you know, from the 1870s until the 1960s, 100 years of that. So there's still living people who went through that kind of, it was, you know, with the rise of the Native movement in the 1960s, at least by 1972, the Indian Self-Determination Act that went through, it took away the mandatory requirement for the boarding schools.
What aspects of capitalism are still encroaching on Native peoples today?
Native peoples' land is mainly mining and oil extraction. It's been for a while, since post-World War II, when they identified, you know, uranium exists everywhere, but they made it seem like, and I remember this, that it was a rare substance found only in certain places that happened to be on Indian land, in Nevada and northern, in New Mexico, and in the state of Washington. Interesting, you know, and these were the only places with uranium, but so they just devastated those lands, you know, with open pit uranium mines. The densest part of Indian land is New Mexico and into northern Arizona, and they are, you know, just under the boot of resource extraction. And the pipelines, of course, are a big issue now, where they're trying to cross Native land and getting a lot of resistance from Native people.
And thousands of people recently came out to support Native-led struggle in New Mexico to have Columbus Day ended as a holiday, and they won. From Keystone XL, which is what you're talking about, to change the name movement. Where's the struggle today, and how can we build solidarity with the movement of resistance?
I don't know more in the fall of 2011 and Christmas time, 2011. Just followed right on the Occupy movement. I think is sort of the Indians got the ideas, sort of like when they civil rights movement doing sit-ins at restaurants and all. Native people thought, sit-in, how can we apply that? So they took over Alcatraz. They sat in at Alcatraz. They took over land, you know, different land bases around. But they got the idea from the sit-ins, you know, so these things kind of interact with each other. The Native movement is, this year they've been working for years, you know, ever since we started going to the United Nations, you know, in 1977, demanding that Columbus Day not be a national holiday, and that there be a day of mourning on October 12th every year for the onset of colonialism that Columbus and genocide that Columbus represents as the initial act. And only Berkeley went for it, you know, like in the 1980s, Berkeley became declared Indigenous Peoples Day. Every year it happens, but this year, suddenly there was this shift, and city councils and like towns in Oklahoma and of course Albuquerque, these real colonial places, you know, were actually declaring the holiday. Washington State and Seattle and Portland, and so it's I think it was a real boost, you know. It's a small thing, it's a symbolic thing. The mascotry movement is really important, not just the Redskins, but there are Redskin, something like 300 high schools in the United States have Redskins as their name, so there's much local work that's done in these different places. You realize that it's not just about football or about the sport or about just hanging on to a name. It really is about keeping that history intact, you know, of domination.
Mi nombre es Hilario Hernández Sánchez, soy originario de Metepec, Estado de México. Yo haría una invitación a ver la riqueza cultural que tenemos en cada uno de los rincones donde habitamos en Latinoamérica y darnos cuenta de la riqueza. A lo mejor no es una riqueza monetaria, pero la riqueza cultural que se tiene es en todo el mundo. Yo le puedo decir que no hay otro continente más rico en tradiciones, simplemente en comidas. No he conocido a algún latinoamericano que le niegue la entrada a la puerta de alguien y que no le ofrezca un vaso de agua y que no le ofrezca algo de comer. Solamente los que mandan son los que ponen esas barreras para que no pase a otro país. Si fuera por gente normal como nosotros, no habría esas barreras.
During all this time, they have